Right, it is half past, so I will kick off and we'll just continue to let people in as we go. Look, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's Australian Naval Institute webinar, Unpacking the Maritime Elements of the 2026 National Defence Strategy. For those who don't know, I'm Jennifer Parker. I am an ANI counsellor and also a few affiliations with think tanks across Australia, including Defence and Security Institute, Lowy, etc. I'm going to moderate today's discussion. Unfortunately, Justin Burke from the National Security College couldn't join us today, but we have some wonderful panellists up. Before I get to that, I just want to give a little bit of a plug to the Australian Naval Institute. For those that are unfamiliar, the Australian Naval Institute is Australia's independent forum for exchange of ideas and naval and maritime matters. Founded in 1975, so 51 years old now, it brought together serving and former defence personnel, industry and academia, and the broader strategic community to contribute to informed debate on maritime affairs. Importantly, it is the support of ANI members that allows the Institute to undertake activities like today's webinar, along with publications, podcasts, seminars, and broader contributions to the Australian maritime debate. If you do enjoy today's discussion and would like to support the Institute's work and not already a member, you can sign up for membership at www.navalinstitute.com.au. In terms of some housekeeping, we are recording today's webinar. It will be made available in the next couple of days on the Australian Naval Institute's YouTube channel. Audience questions can be submitted throughout the session using the Zoom Q&A function. We'll move to audience questions at around the 45-minute mark. So in terms of what we're here to talk about today, the 2026 National Defence Strategy does place, in my view anyway, the maritime domain firmly at the centre of Australia's strategic outlook. And in many ways, this gradual move towards focusing more on the maritime is historic, I would say, or certainly in the last couple of decades. I think Peter may well talk on this more. I would argue and have done publicly that it does not yet represent a maritime strategy in itself, but it is incredibly focused on the maritime domain. In today's discussion, we're going to examine what the strategy says about Australia at sea, where capability and investment priorities are heading, and whether the current trajectory aligns with the risks identified in the strategy itself. Now, we have three very capable and probably well known to you panellists to help us go through this. We do have with us Vice Admiral Retired Peter Jones, AODSC AM. Peter joined the Royal Australian Naval College in 1974, so just before the founding of the Australian Naval Institute, and served for 4 decades in the Royal Australian Navy across operational, strategic and capability appointments. His operational service included command of HMAS Melbourne during sanctions enforcement operations in Iraq, command of the Multinational Maritime Interception Force during the 2003 Iraq War, and leadership roles in the clearance of the KAA. Peter later served as the Chief Capability Development Group at the rank of Vice Admiral and remains deeply engaged in Australia's strategic and naval policy community as a former president of the Australian Naval Institute and founding member of the Naval Studies Group at UNSW Canberra. Peter, thanks so much for joining us. We also have with us our second panellist is Troy Duggan. You will have seen him all over the media recently, I suspect. Troy is the CEO of C2 Robotics. Troy served for over 30 years in the Royal Australian Navy, including command of HMAS Adelaide and the frigate HMAS Arunta. But I'm sure his career highlight was being my PWO instructor many years ago. In his final Navy appointments, Troy served as the Director of Undersea Warfare, where he contributed to the introduction of AUKUS Pillar 2 initiatives and the advancement of autonomous systems and emerging defence technologies. He now leads C2 Robotics, and which is one of Australia's leading defence technology companies focused on autonomous maritime capability. Welcome, Troy. Our third panellist is Brigadier Retired Will Taylor, OBE. He is a counsellor with the Australian Naval Institute. Will served as a lengthy career in the Royal Marines, retiring in 2014 following his final appointment as Defence and Naval Advisor at the British High Commission in Australia. Following his military service, Will has held senior leadership roles in industry, most recently retiring as the General Manager Weapons at Raytheon Australia. Will brings a unique perspective spanning operational military service, allied defence cooperation, and advanced weapons capability development. And Will, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we will kick into this. I've asked each of our three panellists to offer some opening remarks on their key areas. Peter, I might come to you first with your initial impressions of the National Defence Strategy. What stands out from you in the National Defence Strategy from a maritime perspective?
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. So first off, it's a pretty polished document and the accompanying integrated investment plan. And I think those two glue together quite well. I think it must have been a terribly tricky time for the government and for the department to actually put this together when, you saw the Iraq war playing out and how can they keep up with what's going on. So I think that must have been quite a challenge. And probably unsurprisingly, there's a lot of continuity between these two documents and the documents in 2024. And when Jen asked if I would speak, I thought probably the useful thing for the discussion is just really to concentrate on comparing the 2024 document with the 2026 document suite to see what are the shifts. And really a particular focus there was the strategic overlay, discuss funding, which of course is central to any strategy, and what are some of the challenges in execution. So as I said, there's a lot of continuity, in particular the 5 tasks that the government has set the ADF mission to be, defending Australia and the immediate region, deterring through denial, protecting economic connections, contributing to collective security, and contribute with our partners to the maintenance of the rules-based order. So those things are there. The strategy of denial is there by denial, and also the focused force. And I think those elements are going to be pretty much consistent through the life of the Albanese government. I don't see that there's going to be great changes there. One of the probably important changes in the 26 document is the fact that they talk a lot more about self-reliance, and they're creeping up bit by bit, not only in this document but in other utterances and other documents about actually trying to be more self-reliant. But I would say that it is still quite a way from where the Hawke government was in the 80s, for those who've got a memory, to the industrial settings that the Hawke government put in place, with much greater emphasis on local content and setting benchmarks for local content and so on. And it's probably also not as, or it certainly isn't as far advanced as what the new Canadian government industrial policy is. The big elephant in the room, as we all know, is the unpredictable US national security policy and actions of the second Trump administration, and that must have been a bit of a challenge. And I think if you're unkind, you'd say that that the NDS 26 has a strategy of in denial rather than of denial, but I think that's probably unfair. And I think probably the government is probably thinking that they've got to play the longer game here with the US alliance and hope that things will turn to some form of normal transmission after the 20th of January in 2029. And so I think it's unsurprising that they've tried to emphasise continuity. But it is interesting when you compare the wording between the 2024 document, the 2026 document, when it actually talks about the US engagement. In the 2024 document, they talk about, and I quote, the US is deepening its engagement with its Indo-Pacific partners and allies, recognising that collective approaches are crucial to maintaining regional balance and enhancing collective defence. In contrast, the 2026 document says Australia, the US and other partners are deepening defence engagement to enhance and maintain capability to make greater contributions to collective deterrence as well as to regional and global security. So there's a bit of a dial down there. But I think that probably to emphasise the government's approach, it's interesting to read Admiral Sam Papero's testimony to Congress, which some of you may have seen in a ANI newsletter email. And in that written points he made to Congress, he said the strength of our relationships with our treaty allies, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea, the Philippines and Thailand, provide strategic depth and operational flexibility that no competitor can match. And I think that's, the Australian government quite heartened by that sort of sentiment. One of the interesting things in both the 2024 and the 2026 NDS is the talk about the submarine rotational force west. But I think curiously it is confined to discussion when you're talking about the AUKUS in both documents. And it's hard to judge whether the discussion about the submarine rotational force in those, it's almost like it's downplaying and don't frighten the horses with the Australian public. So I'm not quite sure whether it's that, or is it that the strategic significance to both the US and Australia is not fully grasped. But to be clear, the first US SSN is going to be based in Stirling from next year, 3 others following. So essentially you're talking about basing 4 US SSNs in Australia. And although it's called, submarine rotational base, I mean, you got crew and family living in WA, and the boat's going to be, each one's going to be in place for about 6 years. So that is a big deal, and it's a big deal in terms of strategy. And I think as a lever to keep US engaged in Australian security, that is a big ticket item. And I think that the government, if that's clearly that's part of their calculus, they should really put that up front. Like it doesn't get mentioned in the front part of the document when it's talking about the US alliance, but you're going to have 4 SSNs based in Australia. So I think they could be a bit more forward leaning on that. Just move on to budget. It's harder these days to look at the budget and the IIP than what it was, say, when General Hurley was running capability development in the early 2000s, when you had a DCP and project by project, you could see, the cost bands of each project. So I know it's harder for industry to sort of get their mind around, what is actually there in the IIP. Big numbers, though. In the 2024 budget, the government talked about they're going to spend 50.3 billion over the next decade. So that was from 2023, from 2033, 2034, that sort of up to that 10-year period. In the 2026 budget, it's gone from 50.3 to 53 billion for the next 10-year outlay. So that's an important to look at that. What is clear, though, is that AUKUS is having a big impact on the rest of the budget. And you can see that in a couple of ways. One is I would argue, the cancellation or the retirement early of the C-27 capability. And, from my days in capability development group, whenever you see a whole capability being retired, that's generally because you've run out of salami slicing. And the discussion is, well, we've got to cut a whole capability to save some real money. And I think that's C-27 is probably a indicator of that. And the second one is, if you look at both documents, the 2024 Integrated Investment Plan and the 2026, you'll both see that there's pie diagrams for the outlays to different warfare capabilities. And there are 14 warfare capabilities. In the 2024 one, the key one I just want to point out is undersea warfare. There was 17% of the investment program was going into undersea warfare. In the 2026, that has risen by 6% to 23%. That is the biggest sector investment area now in defence. But I would just suggest that we should look at the 2026 NDS as a waypoint, and be interesting to see next year, or in 2 years' time in NDS 2028, what is the percentage going to essentially the submarine capability? So it's gone from 17 to 23, and will it go on further? Clearly, in this next later years, as Jen has pointed out, there's actually buying actual submarines associated with that, but you can see it's putting a real pressure on the budget, and I've sort of likened it that AUKUS has a kryptonite effect on the rest of the ADF, intentionally or unintentionally. It's just a fact of life at the moment, that as it grows and the demands to fund it, unless you have a big increase in the rest of the defence vote, you're going to inevitably weaken other parts of the ADF. And I think that's a bit of a challenge. Some of you may have read November last year, the ANI reprinted one of James Goldrick's papers that he gave in 1999. He gave a very interesting talk to the Thai Navy, and he talked about medium-power navies in the 21st century. And in part, he talked about, and it's something I know Jen's talked about, is the need for a medium-power navy to have a balanced fleet. And so he talked about all the aspects of a balanced fleet, but he did caution, and he said it is possible to fall into the trap of pouring resources into one element of the fleet when others equally vital to a medium navy are being neglected. And I think we just got to be careful we don't fall into that trap with AUKUS, and we just got to have eyes wide open. And what can we do to mitigate that kryptonite effect? Because it's clearly unintentional, but it has a big impact not only on the rest of the Navy, but also the ADF itself. And I think, just as a cautionary tale, it's interesting looking at the Royal Navy now. The Royal Navy, when you look at its destroyer frigate force, has 11 ships, 11 frigates and destroyers. We have 10. If you look back 125 years to when the RAN was set up, if you told a Royal Navy admiral that one day the Australian Navy would be near parity with destroyers and frigates, they would just find it inconceivable. But I think that's a cautionary tale about they're struggling to maintain two nuclear submarine classes and do replacements and all that sort of thing. It's just a real challenge. And just finally, my final comments on shipbuilding and in the context of challenges, with the Mogami and the Hunter class, very capable ships, one of the unprecedented challenges we will have is we have not ever had two programs running with two quite distinct supply chains. That builds in challenges in terms of construction, but big challenges going forward in terms of sustainment. And it's something that the Naval Studies Group talked about in their Australian Maritime Strategy 2035, with a whole bunch of other issues about personnel, which I recommend people, they may want to look at the Naval Studies Group website and just have a look at that monograph, because it talks about some of those challenges of trying to run and maintain that capability and in an affordable way. So I'll just leave it there, Jen.
Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks for flagging the UNSW Naval Studies Group's 2025 Australian Maritime Strategy. It does cover a lot of the challenges I think we will talk about today. Really appreciate you highlighting what is continuity between the strategies and what is slightly different, especially some of those financial pressures. Now, in terms of something that's been touted as a key difference between the 2024 strategy and the 2026 strategy, has been certainly in the speech from the Deputy Prime Minister and press commentary from others, the focus on autonomous capabilities. So specifically uncrewed underwater vehicles and uncrewed surface vessels. There's also some stuff on uncrewed ground vehicles as well, and of course uncrewed aerial vehicles. In terms of autonomy being a key focus, it seems from my perspective anyway, that this is viewed as a way to bridge some of those clear capability gaps. Now, thinking about uncrewed capability and autonomy, there's probably no better person to turn to now than Troy Duggan, Captain retired RAN, but currently the CEO of C2 Robotics, which has become a focus of the Australian government in terms of the Spear Tooth uncrewed underwater vehicle capability, and also recently successfully agreed an export deal to export some of this capability to the US military. So, Troy, I'll now turn to you. I guess if you wouldn't mind talking us through what you saw as the pivot towards autonomy, if you see that as a pivot, if you agree with that statement, and why you think that is becoming an increased focus for the Australian government and the Australian Defence Force.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. I guess it was interesting that the headline act before the National Press Club release was the focus on autonomy, and we got a heads up on that. I think it was a day or 2 days prior. So it was interesting that that was the one element that the government chose to release as a point of difference. And I guess you and I were both at the National Press Club when that released. And it's obviously significant for our company. It was the first intention of the acquisition for Speartooth, but we're not talking about that today. But the NDS and IIP did prove that there would be $4.8 to $5.8 billion over 10 years focused on autonomous systems. And it's interesting that Peter pointed out about the 23% in undersea warfare as well. So you can see that there's this big slant towards undersea warfare and robotics autonomous systems. And for a lot of people, that seems confusing because it's quite new. I don't think ever in the history of Australia have people been focusing on undersea warfare. I think people vaguely knew that we had submarines, and they thought that that alone represented undersea warfare, which is quite interesting. But it is, and I do find myself having to talk to people about seabed warfare and the wider picture and sea lines of communication and seabed cables, and that more money runs underneath the water than it does above it, and how we are completely and utterly reliant on those sea lines of communication. Interestingly, we all experienced it yet again with fuel, that we realized that we didn't refine as much fuel as we absolutely need. And that was just one small element of sea lines of communication. Getting back to RAS, it did mention a lot of previously announced programs. I think ministers are well trained now to talk about Ghost Bat and Ghost Shark. Interestingly, I named the Ghost Shark to line with Ghost Bat, which makes it easier for people to remember it, which seemingly they do. But they were all previously announced projects. So in terms of a lot of new projects, there wasn't a lot of new things apart from Speartooth. And I guess AUKUS Pillar 2 has been, it's talked about, it's mentioned, but there's not a lot of detail. And I mostly understand that because most of the good work in that Pillar 2, whether it be cyber, hypersonics, or undersea warfare, are generally classified. So unfortunately, the rest of Australia doesn't get to see the amazing work that is happening in the background in that area. And for us, AUKUS Pillar 2, undersea warfare, the whole point of setting up AUKUS Pillar 2 undersea warfare was the understanding that the three countries, if we share payloads and capabilities, not only can we integrate, but we can be interoperate and basically share each other's payloads, payload bays, and each country can work on a set number of payloads. Let's just say 3 each. Therefore, we would all collectively have 9 different payloads, 9 different missions for our systems, and we'll get some incredible synergies by doing it that way. The details on how that is progressing is still vague. We'll probably never hear about that in the public fora, but certainly an exciting capability. And I'll stop there and I'll let you ask me another question.
Troy, I just follow up with one question, and this is a question that I am frequently asked. I don't think a week goes by without being asked this question publicly. In terms of this pivot towards autonomy and within that envelope, uncrewed capabilities, what do you see as the relationship between crewed and uncrewed capabilities, and particularly in the undersea domain? Do you see this as a change, a replacement, or do you see this as a complementary relationship?
All of the above. I think, as we saw in the air domain with UAS, people initially thought these were going to be complementary capabilities. And then Ukraine happened and demonstrated that indeed it was the main effort. And interestingly, I think we are seeing where conventional crewed assets are actually in support of the uncrewed effort. And it's not just really in support of, but we find that there's a realization in attritional drawn-out wars that pretty well every conventional military capability is irreplaceable once it's tried during the life of them. So once you use that F-16, the M1A1, it's gone, and you can't generally build another one in a meaningful time frame to effect on the battlefield. And the contrast with that is obviously autonomous systems. 80+% of all casualties, civilian and military, in the Ukraine war are caused by UAS. I was just having a discussion with a European partner last night, and they just visited Ukraine. And sometimes now that battlefield, the forward edge of the battlefield area, used to be 10 kilometers either side of the front line, used to be quite dangerous. In some areas in the east, that's now grown up to 80 kilometers deep, where you cannot safely move equipment, trucks, vehicles from the battlefield. And that's because of the dominance of overlapping ISR from UAS and drones both day. So it has certainly fundamentally changed the battlefield in ways that people did not predict, on a scale that people did not predict. No one would have predicted 5 years ago that Ukraine would be building more than 5 million drones in 2026. That would have been laughed at. And I think, it also showed and talked about industrial sovereignty and self-reliance. That's what we've also learned from the Ukraine war. And that's why we're seeing Europe with their rearm program. We've just seen a massive increase from the US. The Defense Autonomous Working Group used to have a $224 million budget, which everyone thought, wow, that's quite a lot. I can't believe they've got that. Now they've asked Congress for $55 billion, which represents the largest growth in any single US Department of Defense program. So what does all that mean? What it means is that there are some governments that like to think that UAS are evolutionary. That's very comfortable for people. All of our systems and processes and governance and bureaucracy is built around the long 10-year plus acquisition process, stage gates, lots and lots of paperwork. So governments who have been thriving and living off that, and all their training and processes are derived from that, are addicted to it, whether they are self-aware of that or not. So this whole UAS thing is very, very confronting, and they want to treat it as evolutionary. As you heard with the US, the previous example, that's revolutionary. Although Ukraine did it out of necessity and self-survival, it really probably should be revolutionary. And what we saw from the NDS is the start of it. If anyone thinks that it's going to shrink or autonomous systems are just going to flatline now, I think they're very naive. It's only going to grow, and I think we're going to start seeing devolving or people selling their actual conventional assets. And we saw that with South Korea not taking up their Apaches. Japan is just going to sell their 13 AH-64 Apaches as well. because you're just not seeing these things survive on the battlefield. You're not seeing armored personnel carriers survive anywhere within 20 kilometers of a battlefield. They're not making a difference, and they are not survivable on a modern battlefield. We also make counter UAS systems. We've been working with the Air Force for the last couple of years on that, and obviously cheap, attritable, electro-optically guided, and I'll happily use 10 of those to take on an Apache any day, and we'll do that for under $200,000, and that Apache will be killed. So that's the sort of world we're living in. Now, we're buying and still getting our new Apaches delivered, so that's very uncomfortable that this is acting as a very disruptive change to pretty well every government or every military's acquisition process.
Troy, thank you for that. And you mentioned the disruptive change, and that's something that was recognised, I think, in the Deputy Prime Minister's speech at the Press Club, and is also recognised and acknowledged in the National Defence Strategy, which does talk about lessons from Ukraine. And you focused on a few of them there. One of the questions I have for you, we'll kind of, I guess, finish on this and before we go to Will. What do you see as the differences between, and this is something that's often talked about when we talk about the right lessons from Ukraine, and it was talked about a bit by the Deputy Prime Minister in his speech launching the National Defence Strategy. What do you see as the implications of geography, Australia, Ukraine, for the types of uncrewed capabilities and autonomous systems more broadly that we should be investing in?
Excellent question, and I get that a lot as well about those lessons in Ukraine. They're not transferable to the Indo-Pacific with the extra ranges, the littoral, the significant amount of water. I sort of laugh at that and think they haven't seen anything yet.
Troy, I think you may have dropped off there. Are you still there? No, so we don't currently have Troy. He was just getting to the best bits as well, I'm sure. We haven't talked about cyber warfare, which could be a good segue. But what we will do while we wait for Troy to come back is pivot towards Will. So Brigadier Retired Will Taylor, former General Manager of Guided Weapons at Raytheon. Will, one of the key themes coming through in the National Defence Strategy, but really whenever you hear the current government talk about defence, of course, maritime, a huge focus, AUKUS, a huge focus, but also long-range strike. And Peter mentioned this focus on self-reliance. And so when you look at the National Defence Strategy 26, there is more of an emphasis on self-reliance, as Peter outlined. That self-reliance is generally constructed within the alliance construct. But one of the elements of our move towards self-reliance, as highlighted by government in the National Defence Strategy and more broadly, is our move towards producing certain guided weapons in Australia. So, Will, I wonder if you could talk about what the journey is towards that and what the National Defence Strategy says about guided weapons and strike capabilities.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd kick off by taking a little journey back in time to 2020. The Defence Strategic Update was the birth of GWEO. It stated that government would look to the development of a sovereign manufacturing capabilities for advanced guided weapons and explosive ordnance. That carried on into the 2024 structure plan, which allocated between $58 and $87 billion for strike, integrated air and missile defence and guided weapons capabilities, including for the first time in budget numbers, $1 billion for sovereign manufacturing. If we move forward to the 2024 IIP and then the 2026 IIP, the 24 IIP allocated between about 40 billion and 51 billion to strike and guided weapons capabilities. 26, that jumps to between 46 and 60 or 61 billion. So I think there are some interesting points that fall out of this. One, there's been a line of continuity that's run broadly from the force structure plan through Defence Strategic Review into the National Defence Strategy and the 2026 update. One area that has, if you like, waned has been integrated air and missile defence, which featured strongly in 2020. Priority was reduced through DSR and into the 24 IIP, but has started to re-emerge in 2026 as a priority, although it's difficult to pin down exactly where the money is in the 2026 IIP. Overall, GWEO expenditure is up by between 7 and 10 billion, including targeting between the 24 IIP and the 26 IIP. So what does that mean? Combined GWEO investments since 2021, and by investment, I mean either acquisitions that can be tracked through AusTender or acquisitions that can be tracked through US congressional notifications or ministerial announcements, amount to around $22 billion to date. If you look at the 2026 IIP, approved funding is listed as 15.2 billion, which suggests that of the 22 billion in announcements, there's around about 7 billions worth floating around somewhere in the unapproved bucket. Secondly, there's been a shift between 24 and 26 that benefits Navy to the tune of about $2 billion in increased maritime strike capabilities. Money has shifted away from GWEO into the broader targeting enterprise. I think that C-1300 investments, particularly Tomahawk, Evolved Sea Sparrow missile, the Block 2, and Naval Strike Missile and Standard Missile take up a big chunk of that. Interestingly, key decisions in relation to maritime weapons have been delayed, firstly by the Force Structure, the Defence Strategic Review, and then the Surface Combatant Review, and then the acquisition process to down select the General Purpose Frigate. That obviously drives total hull numbers, which in turn drives the number of VLS cells, which in turn drives what is the likely size of the naval air and missile defence and strike weapons inventory. And so that really hasn't been able to be nailed down until the GPF Mogami decision was made. And hidden in the small print is the fact that Mogami is going to introduce at least one new missile type into the naval inventory because the platform is fitted with the CRAM capability. So that means rolling airframe missile will enter the naval inventory as a short-range air defence capability. Peter referred to in denial versus a strategy of denial in relation to the relationship with the US. We're still heavily dependent on the US for missile and strike capabilities. I think circumstances have significantly changed since the Force Structure Review of 2020, and we've possibly missed some opportunities during that period, in that while we've delayed decisions, the rest of the world has moved on. And an environment in 2020 where there was relatively free access to missile supplies is now highly competitive, with other nations competing for the same missile types that we're competing for. And of course, those missile types are being expended on operations, which means that the US in particular is prioritizing replenishing their own stocks over delivering to overseas customers. I think the other interesting point, again, coming back to something that Troy mentioned, the emphasis on underwater warfare. What about Tomahawk in those platforms? Is the inventory that we're acquiring likely to be large enough? What about the offensive capabilities that we might bring into unmanned surface vessels and unmanned underwater vessels? And the 2026 IIP hints at, for the first time, at introducing naval strike in the form of Tomahawk into Hunter as a class. And I think the last point that I'll round off on is the increased emphasis. It was mentioned, I think, in Osmin 2 years ago, and now risen to prominence in the IIP, and that is maintenance, repair, overhaul, and upgrade of select missile types. The IIP calls out in particular AIM-9X and AIM-120 AMRAAM, but I think given the likely size of inventories, you'd have to be looking at ESSM, Evolved Sea Sparrow, Standard Missile, and other maritime effectors as being likely candidates. I think I'll stop there.
I think you're mute.
I can't blame that on cyber. That's my inability to operate my keypad. But look, thanks so much, Will. That's a very helpful canter in terms of the direction of guided weapons and long-range strike, and something that is clearly a key hallmark of the government's strategy of self-reliance within the alliance. Now, we did get cut off from Troy before, so we'll just go back to that question in terms of the comparison between Ukraine's geography, Australia's geography, and where are the autonomous and uncrewed capabilities that we should be investing in? Troy.
Thanks, Jen. Apologies earlier. That was a computer glitch. I'll blame the computer, not the operator, from my end. Yes, the question was about the differences. Yes, Ukraine is a sort of a largely continental war. There is the Black Sea there. There's a lot more of that sea around the Indo-Pacific. The common thing I get is, well, small little drones don't have a meaningful role in the Indo-Pacific because of the long ranges. And then I laugh at that and go, are you aware of Operation Spiderweb? There are some Russian strategic bombers that were 2,000 kilometers plus away from that battlefield that are destroyed by small drones. There's a Kilo class that is no longer operational because it was destroyed by a small drone. So I think there's a lack of imagination by people. I think they're not noticing the theme that autonomous systems and bigger autonomous systems can carry small autonomous systems. There is many different ways around the range of challenges. None of that is insurmountable. The capability of technology is improving. The strategically relevant ranges that even UAVs are getting. And UAVs, we've also got a 2,000 kilometer range UAV. So this is not complex enough. It's just complex. Congratulations. Having Tomahawk completed a Tomahawk last year, there's actually a lot of similarities between what Speartooth does and what a Tomahawk does above the water. In fact, there may even be similar ranges. So if we can all imagine what a Tomahawk can do, well, then you've got enough imagination to what a large UUV can do, how it can get there and be delivered. So I think it's all very. I think a lot of people are slowly learning and getting familiarized. I think there's a deep lack of education and awareness about autonomous systems and what they're doing. You're getting some people who are really professionally curious are digging into what's happening, and people who have visited Ukraine or the Red Sea or got briefs on the Red Sea and the amount of guided weapon ordnance that was expended during that little the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait show, as well as the latest Iranian demonstration. We are just seeing, certainly Europe is awake to that fully, and it's not just in the take-up of autonomous systems. I'm talking serious 3.5% to 5%, depending on how you measure it, defense budgets. And I mentioned the US example before. So I think Australia is still a little bit in lag. We probably rely on our geography a lot more than probably what we should. But yeah, there's certainly a trend that everyone else, European, Middle East, is now fully awake to the whole Shahed drone problem. So they don't need to be reminded or taught. So yeah, it's certainly what has happened in the last generally 24 months has been quite disruptive.
Well, thanks so much, Troy. We will move to questions now. We've got about 30 minutes left, and I see a number of questions already in the Q&A, so thank you very much for that. If you do have a question for our panelists, I would ask you to put it into the Q&A, preferably the Q&A, not the chat, just because I am not that great at multitasking. So, all right, well, when we look at the Q&A, there's a number of questions there. One that I want to pick up on, and I'll probably go to you, Peter, first, and then ask the other panelists if they have a comment, is this concept of strategy of denial versus sea denial. Of course, the National Defence Strategy talks about the need for sea control, so having our own freedom of manoeuvre on the maritime domain, but also sea denial, denying the freedom of manoeuvre of others. Chris Skinner has asked in the question and answer, he says, the National Defence Strategy continues the strategy of denial, but fails to address the possibility of denial of maritime sea lines of communication on which Australia relies. Do we need a discrete maritime defence strategy? Look, Chris, I think you know that my public answer is we need a Australian maritime strategy, of course, that looks at the civil elements and the defence elements. But I'll first turn to Peter and ask if he's got any comments on the strategy of denial that he spoke about and how that translates into the maritime domain and whether we have some gaps there in our thinking.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, and thanks, Chris, for the question. So I think when you look at the 5 tasks that the government has said, this is what the ADF should be able to do, that when you look at the one about the sea lines communication, that clearly requires not just a force with a denial capability, but one that can exercise sea control. And so I think that what would be useful is for the government in a NDS 2026 or some other document is to actually tease that out and explain that clearly they want you to be able to, or they want the ADF to be able to actually control a water space and an airspace, but they need to actually explain that because I think it is confusing, and at face value it looks quite inconsistent that they say the strategy of predominant ADF strategy is one of denial. And in fact, I think if you've got a bunch of strategists in one room, gave them, this is the document and this is the strategy, how would you describe it? They wouldn't say it's a strategy of denial. So I think it's an unfortunate selection of a badge for the strategy, because when you look at all the things you're asking the ADF to do, it isn't denial. But anyway, I think they're stuck with that lexicon and that and I don't imagine they'll change.
Thanks, Peter. It's one of the things I find myself often explaining in courses on this issue. Troy and Will, before we move on, did you have any comments on broader strategy and strategy of denial versus sea denial and sea control and maritime strategy more broadly?
I think I agree with Peter. I think to have denial and use the word deter, I think we like saying those words. It makes us feel good. I think it makes very senior military officers and governments sound good. I would want to do that. I want some of that, but the funding isn't there to actually achieve it. And if you're looking at who we're trying to deter and deny, a handful of conventional ships to defend a 60,000 kilometre coastline is not probably the mass. So I think it's aspirational. And if it was titled as aspirational, I think everyone would get behind that. But I think it alludes to that we're actually going to do that.
Yeah, I think, Jen, I'd just make the point that I think it's difficult to deny the Pacific and Indian Oceans to anybody, which kind of rounds up on Troy's comment about the scale of force that you would need, and it's an unrealistic aspiration. You might be able to deny bits, designated areas for periods of time and or control designated areas for periods of time. But, realistically, how do you choose those areas? How long can you control them for? It's a bit like having local air superiority. How do you achieve local maritime superiority? I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you. And all very good and valid comments. It's interesting, actually, when you look at the history of how the catchphrases around our strategy eras develop, whether it be forward defence or defence of Australia, and some of the discussions, you can see how deterrence by denial develops, because it's easy to roll off the tongue as opposed to a description of our strategy. Now, pivoting, we have a question from Don Deacon Bell, and I think this is a really good one. We've talked a bit about the National Defence Strategy and some of the themes. So clearly, major surface combatants is a theme, and we've mentioned the Megamis. We've talked a little bit about AUKUS, the theme of undersea warfare, the theme of GWEO, and the theme of autonomy. Don Deacon Bell talks about, he refers to James Goldrick's speech that Peter talked about and the concept of a balanced fleet. He says, is there a concern in Navy that the threats to Australian maritime trade from threats such as mine warfare, USVs and other asymmetric threats is being neglected? These threats are very much in focus, given the examples in the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf. Now, of course, nobody here represents the Royal Australian Navy, so we can't talk to their views on it. But I think this is a really important question. When you talk about a balanced fleet and a balanced capability, have we neglected some of those areas? And I'll note, on mine warfare, I actually do have a piece coming out in the Australian IELTS supplement talking about mine warfare. In the National Defence Strategy 26, there is 3 paragraphs, in the Integrated Investment Program, so the supplementary document, there is 3 paragraphs on mine warfare, which is an increase of the 1 paragraph on mine warfare that was in the National Defence Strategy 26, but no clear funding line. So look, I think I'll turn to Troy first to talk about this. You know, are we degrading balance within naval capabilities, and are there gaps? And then I'll go to the other panelists.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an admission by the government with the NDS in 2024 that we would become a focused force, not a balanced force. One of the costs of that word change is the fact balance means we're going to drop capabilities and we're going to lose capabilities to bolster those that we think are going to be of more utility. One of those was clearly mine warfare. Interestingly, the long touted, not very surprising Straits of Hormuz mining risk has reared its ugly head again. So yeah, that is a cost. To do everything in a balanced way costs a lot of money. We've stayed, at 2.02% of GDP. We're still trying to fund nuclear submarines and the training and infrastructure for that out of that budget. So the way I describe it is the pies are getting smaller. The cost of technical inflation has grown. Inflation actual has grown. The cost of people has grown. So basically it's forcing the Department of Defence to do what it has always done with a diminishing slice and cutting of that pie. And therefore they've had to, remove, in this case, recently C-27 Spartan, and a couple of years ago, the mine warfare C-1905, or the guts of that. So it's a government decision. See if it works out in the future.
Thanks, Troy. Peter or Will, did you have any comments on that? Peter, I know that you've got a lot of views on focused versus balanced force.
Yes. Thanks, Jen. Once you go from a balanced force to a focused force, you inject a lot of risk because you provide a potential enemy with opportunities to exploit weaknesses. Just in terms of mine warfare, I think one of the key bits will be once we have US SSNs running out of Stirling, there will be a need to have a mine countermeasures force operating out of there. Now, the 2026 document, which Jen highlighted, that talks about having remote vehicles in that three sentences. It also talks about paying off the existing crewed mine countermeasures vessels. But you will have to have some sort of MCM capability to ensure access for those SSNs. And that may lead to a bit of a resurgence. But I think there's a lot that could be done to actually have a more balanced force than what we currently do. But we don't help ourselves by the way we acquire equipment. And what I mean by that is that we don't follow best practice for shipbuilding. So the best practice for shipbuilding is you stick with a basic design philosophy. You build ships in batches, and so on, and you reduce your cost of ownership by having lots of commonality. That is what most navies do. We have the most heterogeneous fleet in the world, from, Heinz 57 variety of countries with different subsystems and so on. So we don't help ourselves in terms of, we have a very expensive fleet to build and a very expensive fleet to sustain ourselves. And also we suffer by not having a national defence prime company that you would go to produce a lot of the wherewithal, like, Sweden and so on. So we've got a lot of structural things that we could do to improve matters, but what that does mean is, particularly when you chuck in, you want to have nuclear submarines. I think when the FSR started and, they were given, you will have nuclear submarines, they're almost forced to go to a focus force rather than a balance force, because it was just going to swallow up so much funding. So, but there's more you can do, but mine warfare is clearly an essential enabler.
Thanks, Peter. Will, did you have any comments on that before we go to the next question?
I think I'd just reiterate the point that Peter made, that I think mining is something that's more likely to be done to us than we're likely to do to somebody else. So our priority in the maritime area should be on counter mining rather than offensive mining.
Thanks, Will. If you're interested further in the mine warfare conversation, a slight plug, there is a recent webinar on the Maritime Matters YouTube, which talks about Australia's mine warfare capability. And I do have a piece coming out on the 26th of May talking about this issue. Now, moving away from capability, or at least hard capability, and moving towards people capability, we have a question from Lauren Summers. Lauren says that Troy made the point that there's a lack of imagination in how we read what's happening on modern battlefields. Is the same true of how we're thinking about the workforce behind autonomous systems? Are we training people for the capability we're buying and building, or for the capability we used to buy? Now, that's a really tough question on workforce, but it is, I guess, one of the things thinking about the force that the National Defence Strategy 26 is projecting. And of course, there's a lot of conversation around recruitment and retention. We won't focus on that here. That's kind of a separate conversation. Are we training the force for the right capabilities, or do we need to be developing our people, our sailors, our officers, who are much more adept at uncrewed capabilities, 3D printing, all of those kind of new directions? Will, I'll ask you first. I think you'll come at this with a unique background, being a former Marine, and then head to Peter and Troy.
Yes and no. I think we often overcomplicate what we think the workforce requirements and challenges are. So if I use GWEO as an example, the majority of the workforce that you would need to build or maintain guided weapons in Australia actually probably would be roughly comparable to the workforce that you would use to service cars. That sounds bonkers, but modern cars are driven by computer systems, and fundamentally people who maintain cars interrogate the computer system, and then the computer system tells them what to fix. That's not unlike the test equipment that is used in both the construction and the maintenance of missiles. So if you can produce a workforce that's technically capable and computer literate, then you need, admittedly, a smaller number of experts to be able to do the really technical stuff. But for the most part, if you've got a good, broad base of technically literate people, then you've got what you need to be able to build missiles. And I can't see why autonomous systems would be any different to that.
No, thanks, Will.
Troy will doubtless have a view.
I'm sure he will. Look, I'll just go to Peter first, and then Dr. Troy, to see if you have any comments on how we're preparing our workforce.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Just to build on what Will said, I think when you look at, just take navies, for example, is if you look at over a span of decades, the number of categories and specializations have changed dramatically over time. And it's really in response to the technology And I think what it highlights is the importance of probably what Troy's talked about, is you need to field these systems, these autonomous systems, in a reasonable number into the force to get experience and to understand what are the skills you need, what are the sort of people that you need, so that you can expand and so that you can have a basis for understanding how you actually train people and so on. So I think it's got to go beyond just, buying a couple of ones for trials and all that sort of thing. You actually have to field some in some reasonable numbers and get them in the field, and then you can understand, okay, so what do we need to do to properly skill our workforce?
Thanks, Peter. Troy, did you have any comments on that question?
Absolutely. Living with a nightmare, maybe train.
Troy, you're difficult to hear, unfortunately.
The wind has just picked up, just as you asked the question.
You're fighting through.
Yeah, I'm fighting through. Fighting the problem of workforce. The Australian Navy, most militaries, Western militaries, have suffered from hollowness, and some of the long training lead times. If you look at submarine COs, that's an extreme example. The beautiful thing about autonomous systems is that you can get someone one or two people to monitor an Oceus bluebottle, to monitor 4, 8, 12 of them. And same with Speartooth, you only need 2 people to monitor 50 Speartooth. And the training overheads are extremely low. So it's actually a welcome relief compared to what we've seen, that trend of, as we introduce MH60 Romeos, F-35s, the training, the lead times, the security overheads are getting longer and longer and putting more and more strain on our workforce. So it's a pleasant pivot where we're actually starting to reverse that and democratize some of those capabilities, so more people, less people can operate more systems and still have an effect. So it's a positive trend. We haven't yet seen that pivot. The MASU, or the Maritime Autonomous Systems Unit, only got stood up or formally announced 2 weeks ago. So it's early times yet, but as that unit stands up, it will probably surprise people how quickly that could deliver. That unit, even with 2 weeks' notice, could start to deliver a minimum viable capability, just because of the systems doing all the heavy lifting and smart. It only takes days at most to train on most of those autonomous systems that were a part of C1200.
Thanks, Troy. I'm gonna be a terrible moderator and offer just a quick comment that I was thinking of, and it's something that I often contemplate when it comes to workforce. I think in some ways, ensuring your workforce is prepared to pivot to new capabilities or new concepts or new doctrine or changes in threat, a lot of that also just comes down to culture. Are you creating a workforce of people who are confident in themselves, who are inquisitive, who are technically literate and ready to pivot to different challenges, or are you creating a workforce that is dependent on hierarchy, dependent on delegating decision making up? But I think a lot of that is a conversation that needs to be had about how you prepare your workforce to be dynamic. Because, if we end up in a high-end conflict, the capabilities that we may well be using may not even exist right now. We're going to be asking them to be incredibly versatile. So I'll offer that comment. Now, I'm just going to pivot a little bit. One of the things we haven't talked about is shipbuilding. Clearly a part of the Australian Maritime Strategy, as it's been articulated, is this focus on continuous military shipbuilding or naval shipbuilding, and of course some amphibious capabilities for Army that we haven't really touched on. Daniel Campbell has a question there about, are there risks to limiting shipbuilding to just 2 locations, Osborne and Henderson, or does the concentration create positives for supply chain and workforce, which out of the way risk of missile strikes taking out those locations? And I think there's probably 2 threads in that. One, to touch on where we're going with continuous shipbuilding. 2, Will did mention that one of the differences in the National Defence Strategy 26 to 24 is, or certainly the integrated investment program, 26 to 24 is the focus on integrated air and missile defence, which seemed to be a gap with some projects cancelled in 24. So I'll just go to our panellists. I might start with Peter first and then go to Troy and then Will, just to offer some comments on shipbuilding, the plan, locations, and integrated air and missile defence. And I guess that goes to our vulnerability in terms of our critical infrastructure and bases as well in Australia.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, and thanks, Daniel, for your question. So in the 1980s, when computer-aided design started to really be fielded into shipbuilding, when we built Newcastle and Melbourne, down in Melbourne, that was the first time it was done with modules. And part of the strategy then, which is relevant to your question, is that there was a recognition that there were discrete and small numbers of skilled workers around the country. And so if you could build the modules, in this case, it was in South Australia, in Newcastle, Melbourne, and then you actually were able to harness those sort of capabilities. That's morphed now to really, they're saying there's going to be these two hubs, and essentially that all the modules are going to be built in South Australia for the ships that they're assigned and so on. I think at the moment, to be honest, it's going to be a big challenge to actually essentially build the capability to do the Magamis on the West Coast. I think there's a big investment to do that. And I think I'd look at it more of the case of, instead of just having one big place, now we're going to have two. So I think that's an improvement, but is more than two the ideal? I would suspect, just in terms of the resources and the skill base and all that sort of thing, we're going to be doing really well to have two viable shipyards to be able to do complex ships. Because when you look at at South Australia, they're going to be doing submarines as well. So that's going to be a real challenge, but there's going to be lots of investment to do both. I think one of the challenges is you've got two different models for how you're going to provide that infrastructure. You've got the Australian Naval Infrastructure government entity, which is really doing all that infrastructure side for Osborne, but it's a different private model for Henderson, and whether you need to change that, don't know. Second part of your question, which is about the risk of strike missiles, I would just highlight the vulnerability of that whole West Coast, that precinct, to some form of drone attack and all that sort of thing. You could imagine that's a vulnerability, and so it was pleasing in NDS 2026 to see emphasis on integrated air defence. And you would imagine that the US, in a period of conflict, they'd have a particular interest in ensuring that their SSNs have adequate air defence protection of their home port.
Thanks, Peter. We are nearly at time, so I'll go to Troy and then I'll go to Will. I'll just ask you to offer some final thoughts as you also address that question. Troy first.
I think the shipbuilding question is a very awkward one. It's very admirable. I think everyone likes the thought of international shipbuilding, and the realities of the size of the technical force across Australia, the shortfall of STEM technical staff, and also we don't have enough critical mass to seriously do it. And it depends on what point do you think is a reasonable point of subsidisation on that. That's a personal opinion that everyone might have. How much you're willing to pay. I'm not quite sure what the latest cost factor is for the Hunter class, and I don't think we're going to see that being advertised widely, how much each of those Hunter class are going to cost, how long they took, how much money we've already poured into them, and how much those 48 VLS, how long they will last. It's a fascinating question and a long discussion. But again, I'll be the autonomous systems guy. You can make a spear tooth in days. So a little bit different, and you can adapt to what is happening around you due to all those external factors, which when Hunter was first conceived, the world's changed very considerably. And because of the length of that program, like big capital shipbuilding, it is exposed to all of those external factors, both what's happening around technologically and politically and through multiple governments. So they're complex beasts. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Troy. Will, any final comments?
I'll talk less about the infrastructure and more about the integrated air and missile defence component. Kind of where do you start? Darwin, Tyndall, Osborne, Henderson, Garden Island, Canberra, Jock, Townsville. You know, if you look at that, it's absolutely clear that you can't park a Hobart class off the beach on each one of those, nor is there sufficient capability in the Land 19 short-range air defence missile capability we've currently got in defence. So it implies that the level of investment that is going to be needed to counter the kind of drone attack that Peter was talking about is going to be significant. And while active missile defence does reappear in the IIP 2026, there's an interesting little footnote, and the small print suggests that the funding has been double counted alongside the funding that's been allocated against each of the domains for strike and other weapons. So it's not clear how much effort is going into that. But one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that it's not going to be sufficient to be able to protect all the things that we need to protect, particularly from what you might describe as a mass drone attack.
Thanks, Will. Now, Peter, I didn't give you any closing comments. Did you want to offer some closing comments on National Defence Strategy 26 before we wrap up?
No, only that, as I said, it'd be interesting to see, looking at the figures in 2 years' time, to see what the split of allocation between the different warfare areas and just how the undersea side will affect the other areas of the ADF.
Well, look, thanks, Peter, thanks, Troy, and thanks, Will. Thank you all for participating. I'm sorry there was a significant number of questions that we didn't get to. Questions about grey zone and hybrid warfare and how we're preparing for those, which would have been wonderful to explore. I'd flag that I did write a paper about Australia's need for a Coast Guard, which addresses some of those elements. And also a question in there about large optionally crewed surface vessels, which has been retained in the National Defence Strategy 26 and the Integrated Investment Program, but the direction of that is a little unclear. So sorry we didn't get to those. And of course, there's a number of questions there about how we conceptualise self-reliance within the alliance, which is probably one of the questions for our time. I would give a plug. I'm writing a paper for Lowy on that exact topic that should be out in about August or September. But before I close, I would like to thank our panellists, Peter, Will and Troy, for taking the time to give us your thoughts on the maritime elements of NDS 26. I'd also like to say to all participants that if you enjoyed today's discussion, please consider supporting the Australian Naval Institute through membership. It is the support of ANI members that allows the Institute to undertake webinars like this, along with publications, podcasts, and broader contributions to Australian maritime strategic debate. Membership is available on the website. It's relatively cheap, and for those in the industry, it's of course tax deductible, so give that a crack. Thank you again, Peter, Troy and Will, for an excellent discussion, and thank you to everyone who joined us online today. As I mentioned at the start, the recording of the webinar will be made available by the Australian Naval Institute YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.